name is Leah Petit. And in January of 2025, I lost my job because the Trump administration took office and realized that 1% of the federal budget went to foreign assistance. So they cut it. They cut it and they dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development. Along with losing my job, with many of my colleagues, we were also demonized. We were told that we were radical lunatics and criminals because we wanted to work towards a better future, not only for the United States, but for the world. In this podcast, we're going to meet those radical lunatics. And the first radical lunatic we're going to meet today is Cathy Nguyen. She was a former USAID colleague of mine and an absolute pleasure to work with. She has over 20 years of experience advancing humanitarian and public service programs in Africa, Asia, and in the United States. So let's learn more about Cathy and how she is not a radical lunatic. Cathy, welcome to the show.
Hi, Leah. Happy to be here.
And Cathy, where are you calling in from?
I am calling in from Honolulu, Hawaii.
I know, I wish I was there. All right, we're going to do our homage to USAID because at USAID, we were constantly confronted with having to do an icebreaker around a fun fact. And you should know this as a coordinator. I'm sure you were one of those that was like, tell us a fun fact. So what was your go-to fun fact at USAID?
So I have to say, I am a huge fan of fun facts. And I believe in a true fun fact. Like, if you tell me that you run every day, that's not a fun fact. Sorry, judgy, but yeah, I've seen that. I think that people should use the fun fact to like sort of stretch themselves. So my fun fact, or one of my many fun facts, is that I have 3 cowlicks. See, that is a fun fact. Completely useless, right? A fun fact is supposed to be slightly useless.
Well, and you know, it is something that people struggle with. I remember my cousin had a cowlick, and he could only go to one barber, and like when he was younger, and it was only this one, or he would be really upset about it. So I think there's others that can relate to you.
Maybe have a peer group. I don't think it's a disability, but we could have a support group.
All right. So even with 3 cowlicks, you were able to persevere, move forward. But where did you grow up?
I grew up in Honolulu. Actually, I was born in what was then Saigon, Vietnam. And my father was studying in the United States in Honolulu. So toward the end of the Vietnam War, my mother was able to leave Vietnam partly because her husband was already in the United States. And that's how my mother and I landed in Honolulu. And that's why I grew up here. And I stayed here until I left for college.
Now, Cathy, the story, though, is crazy. The way that you left Vietnam.
It is a kind of crazy story. It's a little crazier the way my mom left Vietnam. So as I mentioned, my father, actually it starts with my father. My father had completed his required military service with the Vietnamese military. He had, I believe he had served as a doctor, a medic. He completed that service and he was going to go back to his job as a professor at the University of Saigon Medical School. And at that time, there was a bit of a transition of pedagogy. So Vietnam was a former French colony. So the educational system was based on the French pedagogy. And when the Americans started coming to the country, they had formed relationships and wanted to retrain cadres at the University of Saigon under the American system. So my father was selected to study under a USAID scholarship, actually, to do his master's training in public health in the United States. And he selected Hawaii because of the weather. He's very sensitive. He was very sensitive to the cold. So he wisely chose Hawaii. He came to the United States during the conflict in Vietnam, began his studies, and was still in his master's program when it was clear that it would not be safe or would be a better idea for my mother and me to leave Vietnam to join him. And so my mother had actually many opportunities to find a seat on a plane, but it was through, I believe it was through the assistance of her professor at the University of Saigon Medical School. She was able to secure a seat on a plane leaving Vietnam for the United States. She left with me. I was less than 2 years old. I have no idea. I don't have pictures of it, but I'm assuming she basically just had clothes and a baby and maybe a bag. And that was it. And she said goodbye to her mother, whom she never saw again. Her siblings She were able to eventually also leave Vietnam gradually throughout the years, but her mother didn't. So I'm sure she did not expect to be in that situation, to never see her mother again. So I can't imagine what she was going through. She was in her mid 20s at the time. But she and I left on a plane, and we were supposed to go to California, I believe. But the plane had to do a stopover. And I even think originally the plane was supposed to stop over in Guam and probably refuel or something and then continue to California. And instead, the plane stopped in Hawaii, in Honolulu, and all the passengers went out, stretched their leg, waited for the plane to refuel. And my mother was like, "Oh, my husband is here in Honolulu and I have his phone number. Maybe I'll go and see if I can contact him." And so she just chose this random person who was there, who was helping with the people who were off the plane. It was another Vietnamese immigrant. And so she came up to him and said, "This is my phone number of my husband who is studying here." And the man looks at the piece of paper. He says, "Oh, I know this guy. He's a friend of mine."
The luck of
The
that.
luck, right? Because she could have gone directly to California. We could have gone directly to California. I don't know if she had money. I'm sure there was services there. She could have eventually used a phone to contact my dad. But yeah, we happened to land in Honolulu. She happened to find someone who knew him.
I know.
And so instead of stopping off in Honolulu and continuing on to California, I guess, was able to leave the plane and stay in Hawaii. And of course, my dad wasn't expecting us. He's like, "Oh, hi."
But it kind of there's so much luck, right? Like you stop in
Mhm.
Honolulu, you meet like your mom meets someone who knows your dad, contacts him. But also, wasn't it the day that you left was the day where Saigon?
Yeah, actually, the day we arrived in Hawaii was the day that the helicopters left. That iconic footage of helicopters leaving the top of the U.S. embassy with people hanging on hanging on as the last helicopter flew off. So there was a lot. I think there was a lot of luck that takes place in any kind of conflict situation, right? Like who gets to go on a plane, who gets to who gets to be inside the gates when they close. Yeah, we just are very grateful and thankful.
And it's fascinating how USAID facilitated part of that process with the scholarship for your mom.
Yeah. So USAID is it was an agency that evolved. It responded to different needs. And so at that time of its history, USAID was offering scholarships to foreign nationals to study. USAID used to continue doing that, not necessarily these long-term scholarships, but these short-term trainings and workshops. But back then they offered post-education scholarships. And because of that, my dad was eternally grateful. Every time he met someone from USAID, he would always mention these scholarships. You could tell that he was very grateful of that opportunity, and he understood the value of USAID. He understood the meaning of the impact that the agency had on his life and the life of his family.
And was that sort of an undercurrent in the way that you were raised in Hawaii, or was there something else that sort of, helped form your ideas about moving into global development?
Oddly enough, my parents, I think because they came from a country that was very under resourced, they probably would have preferred that I stayed in the United States and had a career in the United States. I think a sense of a lot of first generation immigrants, that's what they think, is that they come to a different country for better opportunities and to offer um, a better life for their children that they may not have been able to find in their country of origin. And so to have their child or their children go back to an under-resourced environment willingly for long term is probably would be a little shocking to them. So I actually started my development career, my experience overseas as a Peace Corps volunteer, precisely because I wanted to go overseas. I wanted to do public service and I wanted to speak another language. I was studying French at university and there was an announcement for Peace Corps volunteers in Francophone Africa. So it checked a lot of boxes for me, this opportunity to go into the Peace Corps. And my parents, I think, which is true for a lot of first generation immigrants, just didn't understand what Peace Corps was about. But they were open-minded enough, and I think I was just stubborn enough that they allowed me to pursue that and to continue along that path, even though I'm sure they wanted me to do something a little more lucrative.
Well, I'm sure, but it's also their fault. Apparently, they were giving you some really strong principles about giving
Yeah.
back.
Their fault for not being more disciplinarian.
Yeah. I mean, where should we be pointing the finger?
Parents are always at fault, like no matter.
Yeah, that's what I've learned as a parent.
Yeah, clearly.
So looking back, it sounds like, going into development work, this wasn't something that was like steady. Like this wasn't like this is where I'm going. It was more of like, let's try it out. Let's
Mhm.
see where my path goes.
At the end of my bachelor's experience, I still was trying to figure out. I had a liberal arts degree, like all liberal arts graduates are like, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I guess I'll go and get a master's or go abroad. All I knew was that I wanted to do public service. And the idea of public service or community service was actually something that I had instilled in me even in high school. I went to a high school where being aware of your surroundings and being aware of giving back to your community, that was a priority for my high school. And so throughout high school, I did volunteer activities. I tutored. I think I did Meals on Wheels once. And then in university, similarly, I tutoring in the summers. I did always some type of community service activity. And so the idea of being able to continue that as a career, starting with a Peace Corps, really vibed with my spirit at that time. And I think that just has grown into the bigger picture of public service that USAID embodies.
And it sounds like too, Hawaii meant a lot to you and gave you a foundation for the work that you want to do as well. Or am I making that
Yet
up?
again, Leah. Well, not quite actually, but I think as I grew older, I think the importance of this ethic in Hawaii had more prominence. So when I was growing up, I have to admit, I wanted to see the world. I wanted to see something outside of Hawaii. Beautiful place, like a great place to grow up, great place to raise children, great place to find a community. But as this angsty teenager, I just wanted to see more. And which is why I left the islands, went to do my schooling on the continent, coming back as an adult and also with children. I started to realize, like, what is it about Hawaii that makes it so special? Why do people stay here at all? And I think what I really appreciate is just this respect for community in Hawaii and respect for land as well. But this awareness of other. We talk about like aloha, right? You come to Hawaii, you always get this aloha spirit. What does that mean? Like the aloha spirit, but it really just means like, caring for others and having this awareness of others. And then recently, another, I wouldn't say concept, but another priority in local life is this sense of kuleana, what we call kuleana. And it means basically responsibility. And I love that idea that you have a responsibility to your community. Well, you have a responsibility to yourself, but you have a responsibility to the people around you. Kuleana really, I think, at its core is about responsibility to the land, the responsibility of taking care of the environment and taking care of Hawaii. But you can broaden that to land in a more conceptual idea of the people who inhabit the land. We also talk about kuleana not just to Hawaii, but to the world. So I feel like as I have spent more time in Hawaii, having coming back with my family, like that has become a lot more core for me is what is my responsibility to the world? And how can I also instill that to my children, like that they are not just here to live their own lives, but that they have a kuleana to their immediate community and perhaps to the wider world that we all live in. Which sounds very new agey, but it's very strong.
Well, it's not new agey. It sounds like it's very old.
That's true. Yeah. Very
But
original.
also, I like what you're saying here too about you. We have a collective responsibility. We don't just take, but we also have to be responsible about how we take and what we give back.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to what you did at USAID. How would you explain your role at USAID to family and friends?
At USAID, I worked for I think it was called a division. Um, was it called a division? Strategic Coordination and Communication Division. It wasn't that long ago.
I know it's like it's all gone.
Yeah, gone. I just want to watch Netflix. And that division took care of a lot of the more supportive functions. So at USAID in the Office of HIV/AIDS, we had mostly technical offices. As you know, you worked in the technical office for capacity building, and there were technical offices that worked on prevention work or treatment work. And our office was a bit more cross-cutting, where we did a lot of the supportive work that brought together people from all the technical offices toward certain more focused projects. And my role was to manage the platforms of information exchange between our technical advisors in our headquarters office with the program staff in the different countries.
And when you think about just the different roles that you've had at USAID, can you share a moment where you really saw the impact of your work, where you felt like, yes, this is great?
I went on a site visit with one of our colleagues, someone that you and I both worked with very closely, to Cameroon shortly before the agency didn't exist anymore. And we went on site visits to deepen relationships with the government, to do some program reviews, and to see how the programs were rolling out on the ground, to hear from program participants and the organizations that implemented them, just to hear what their challenges were and to understand if there was a way that we could support them more with any actions at a headquarters side. So as part of our site visits, organizations commonly have these moments of testimonials. And we heard from them during the site visit. We heard from a mother and her son who had been going through a very difficult interpersonal relationship. The mother was HIV positive. Her son had found out he was HIV positive. He was an adolescent. He was going through adolescent angst and couldn't understand the sickness. He wanted to be left alone. He didn't want to go to school, and he wasn't taking his medication. When someone has HIV, they can live a life that is just as long as someone without HIV, as you know, if they take their medication. And so this mother was going through so much anxiety about the health of and the mental well-being of her son. And she participated in a program that supports vulnerable children, families of vulnerable children. That program convinced her son to attend a peer support group with other adolescents, kids his age, boys his age, who were infected with HIV, who were taking their medicines, and they convinced him to go back to school. The program rebuilt this relationship between mother and child. And we heard directly from the mother and from the son about how life-changing that was. I mean, it was a life and death change. Yeah. And it's not unique to this program. It was not unique to Cameroon. This is every participant of a USAID program for families of orphans and vulnerable children. That money really did a lot and so efficiently, because we're not talking about like $1 million program. We were talking about a program that was probably like a few $100,000, right?
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
goes so far.
And I think that point too about it's not just getting pills to a country. It's about then how do you distribute those pills and how do you engage with the people that are going to need to take them?
It's a whole universe of support. When
Yeah.
we talk about HIV care, we talk about the continuum of care. So it's like you said, it's not just about here's a pill. You need to explain, for instance, to a child or even to an adult who doesn't understand what they're going through. You need to explain why this pill is important. You may be able to get that pill to that person. And then you need all this support to combat all the voices in their head saying that they're a bad person because they have HIV, or combating what they might be hearing from other people. PEPFAR and USAID's general development work is about improving and supporting an enabling universe for people to be well. And I think that's a real loss.
I think often Americans don't connect the points between foreign assistance and impacts here at home. Is there an example or a case you would like to make saying the dismantling of USAID and the blocking of foreign assistance does affect US citizens?
Sectorally, the dismantling of USAID is going to have different levels of impact on the American at home or the American economy. I think in more direct ways, for instance, the food security assistance that USAID provided was very much dependent on American farmers. If USAID is no longer providing subsidized food to countries who are experiencing food insecurity, farmers who were previously growing crops to contribute to that effort, they actually don't have a market anymore for their crops. And so they're going to feel hurt. That's, I think, much more of a direct effect. I think a more downstream effect would be in the health sector. I previously worked on some activities in what we call global health security. So that's the pandemic preparedness. For instance, during the period of COVID-19, some of the infrastructure or systems that helped a country address the epidemic was whether they had trained providers, if they had a surveillance system, if they had a very good lab system to be able to diagnose viruses. So USAID also made investments in these areas in other countries, actually. And that's was one way to contain the spread of infectious disease. So if there is no USAID funding or USAID technical assistance going toward all those health systems to help other countries prevent, detect, and respond to infectious diseases, then there's going to be a greater spread of disease in those countries. And with travelers, that spread of disease can come into the United States. So that's very downstream, but we've seen it with COVID-19. We saw that that happened. So if it happened with COVID-19, it can happen with any other infectious
Right.
disease.
And do you remember when Ebola, like, I don't remember which wave of Ebola, but it was people were really scared about Ebola coming. I think it had made it to the United States at one point. They were concerned
Mm-hmm.
about it getting to Europe. I remember Nigeria was a port that they were very concerned about. And a man came from another country with Ebola into Nigeria. And the doctor recognized it and quarantined him. And he was mad. She stopped him from contaminating all of Nigeria. And then, to what extent then once it gets through Nigeria? And she died as part of that process. But I just think, wow, this woman saved thousands, millions of people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the difficulty, I think, with public health, as you know, is we work in counterfactuals, right? Like we say, because of this, we were able to prevent this many deaths. We see it in HIV. PEPFAR prevented this many babies from being born with HIV, or we prevented this many people from contracting a certain disease. And so it's based on modeling. So you have to have a little bit of faith in science and public health to say, yes, our investments led to something not happening. But I think Ebola is one of those cases, just like you said, where you can sort of make a very informed inference that because of US government investments through CDC, through USAID, through DOD, for certain health systems, like we were able to curb disease. So when Ebola was, when it was a terribly rampant, I want to say I didn't work in this area, so my facts are not straight, but I'd say it was around 2014. And that was a period where CDC staff were being told to put on pause what they were hired to do and work on Ebola and do something completely different. So we had a lot of staff while I was working in Tanzania. We had some staff at CDC who were asked, voluntold, to do 2 months of service in a different country to help specifically with Ebola. And, it diverted a lot of staff, and there was a very large financial investment to help with the containment of Ebola in Eastern Africa. That was 2014. And I'd say almost 10 years later, you fast forward, and in those 10 years, the US government made a lot more investments and assistance and programming in training people, developing surveillance systems, developing networks, and figuring out protocols and frameworks on how to contain the spread of Ebola, should it happen again. So when it happened again, there was no epidemic, there was no spread, because people had already been trained. There are already labs in place that could identify pathogens. And there was no need anymore to divert staff to go and work on a program thousands of miles away, because there was already a local staff and local structures in place to deal with the disease and contain it. And so there was no spread nearly 10 years later. So that was an example of the counterfactual. Like, we have proof that this work actually had an impact on a public health system and on the health of a population.
That's a great story. I will say I did wonder. I was like, why isn't it such a big deal now? Because we heard about Ebola in Uganda, some other places where it was popping up. But you're right that it was contained much more quickly because of the trained staff in those countries.
And it's not it was in multiple countries across West and Central Africa where US investments through multiple agencies helped to build the public health systems to contain spread of disease.
Health systems are so important and we take them for granted.
We take them for granted because we have one in the United States. It's not always well functioning, but we have physicians and nurses, and we have structures, and we have drugs available. My husband just did a lab test, and he got the results literally the end of the day.
Which people don't know that that's not a thing.
That's not a thing.
Some people wait 90 days to get their lab results in some of these countries that we were supporting.
And my husband's lab results were for, the functioning of his liver and his glucose level and his cholesterol level, which are important, but they tend to be what we call those sort of like non-communicable long-term diseases. These lab tests that you're talking about, it's like whether someone has HIV, right? Like
Yeah.
whether their baby has HIV. Like 90 days to a newborn baby is twice its life. So,
Yes.
we don't realize what a health system is because we have one that's fairly functioning. Um,
I mean, and hopefully it continues. Fingers crossed. So, Kathy, when you reflect on all of this work, what is the thing that concerns you the most with the
oh,
dismantling of USAID and the cutbacks on foreign assistance?
well, there's so many things that worry me. I still don't know how people are surviving when they were previously receiving programs and services that were funded by USAID.
Hmm.
So Secretary Rubio said that nobody is dying because of cuts at USAID, but we already know that people literally are dying
That's a
because
lot.
that's a lie. And we have stories, we have direct stories about that. So I think about that because those stories, it's just a handful of people, but USAID in particular served more than 1 million people in different capacities in a variety of diseases, things that are as big as HIV and diseases that are as common as malaria and diarrhea.
I was gonna say diarrhea is a big one.
Diarrhea is a big one. Yeah. Diarrhea is the biggest killer of children. So I don't know how they're surviving. And some of these diseases are, we don't have the USA funding to detect them. So if people don't know that they have them, they could potentially be passing them on to other people. And it's so conceptual, but I don't know how those individuals are managing. And then I don't know in the short term and long term how those countries are going to be managing because they're going to be having a burgeoning unwell population that's not going to be contributing to their economy, that's not going to be contributing to their educational system. They're not going to be growing. And the thing is, like, why does this matter to the United States? It matters because the United States doesn't have trade partners, for instance, right? They don't have trade partners because they don't have these countries with strong economies, with educated populations. And then in certain countries, those people are going to want to move to the United States in manners that are not legal. And so if in the US government is potentially going to be facing a greater challenge with people who don't have legal authority to stay in the United States. So there's a lot of downstream effects of dismantling of USAID that has nothing to do actually with foreign assistance, but it will have impact.
And again, to this like idea of like it's hard to see it in the immediate, but it will show up in the long term,
Yeah.
like anything in public health.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hate this feeling of like there's going to be an I told you so moment.
I don't want
I
an
don't want
I
that. Right.
so moment.
Because it means that we have a problem, right? And we have a problem that there's no workforce to address it. There's not even a vision or a strategy to address it.
I'd rather be doing the work than
Yeah.
being like, I told you
Yeah.
so.
I know. It's the whole like an ounce of prevention. Yeah.
Okay, so there's things that we're clearly concerned about. Where are you finding your resilience, your hope, your way to move forward through all of this?
Yeah. So I'm trying to, I use my time to think a little bit more closer to home, trying to raise my children a certain way so that they grow up to be the type of person I want them to be, with a sense of kuleana, with a sense of community service and responsibility and compassion for others. And try to donate my time. I've been doing some volunteering with a food bank. We have a Return Peace Corps Volunteer Association here in Hawaii. So I try to be active with that group and see ways that that group can support under-resourced or underserved populations in Hawaii. So I think just starting small, right? Like if we think too big, it becomes overwhelming and we throw our hands up. So starting small.
And if there was sort of one action that you would ask people to take up to, help support continue, whether that be foreign assistance or just make the world a better place, what would that be?
Hate to say this, but donate money, right? Like who has money? But money can be like $5 or $10. So my local public radio, I'm a liberal. I listen to public radio. I donate to public radio. And my local public,
That's like a liberal thing.
it's a liberal
It's
thing.
open public radio.
Public radio is objective. And I know that there is a debate on the left leaning bits of NPR. And there was even a joke from like 15 years ago or something at 30 Rock about how this Republican, her dirty little secret was that she donated to public radio. But public radio is public, right? Because it serves the public. It's supposed to be a swath of information. And I think it's an important civic tool. And my public radio station had an emergency fund drive because of the cuts to NPR that took place recently. And so they wanted to raise a certain amount of money. I want to say maybe 20,000 or a little bit more over 2 days. And my public radio station is so lucky that only 6% of its funding, or not public radio station, but the public radio system in Hawaii, only 6% of its funding is dependent on the federal government. So 94% of Hawaii's public radio system is completely privately funded. So they were able to do a very successful advocacy campaign to close the gap of that 6%. And it's just having small bits of funding from a lot of people. I learned that only 10% of Hawaii Public Radio listeners donate. So what about those other 90%? If those 90% only gave $5, and that all those listeners, if you had a $5 subscription per year, you could fund Hawaii Public Radio's entire, annual budget, perhaps. Yeah. So, as much as I hate to ask people to pay money, because I'm certainly not in a position to spend a lot of money, but maybe $5 here, or look through your house and donate things that you don't need anymore. There's going to be someone there who needs it. So that's what I think. I'm thinking in those terms, is like, what can the individual do? And those are small little things that an individual can do.
Small donations matter, as well as information. Clear information.
And voting also matters.
Voting matters. Vote. We've all seen it. All right. Well, Cathy, it has been an absolute pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to expand. And I look forward to hearing about all the other people that you're going to be interviewing.
All the radical lunatics that Donald Trump.
All the radical lunatics and the Antifa stormtroopers.
That's right. This is Leah. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more stories like this, be sure to follow Global Development Interrupted on Substack and Instagram, and listen wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.